Hello, how are you? I hope you are doing well today. We are going to have a great conversation. My name is Tim Kellis, and I not only address but have actually solved one of the biggest problems our society faces today. So let me start this off by asking you a question. Are you married? And in fact, my next question I'm supposed to ask, are you happily married? But unfortunately, I don't want to embarrass anybody. So let me ask this. How would you like to be happily married? And that also includes the single people. Not only people that are married, but people that are single want to know how to create a successful marriage. I have actually solved the marriage problem. Now, that might sound unusual to you because this is probably the first time you've heard it, because I'm the first person to actually do that. So we're going to address the marriage issue today. In fact, one of the big questions I often get is, what do I mean by solving? What is the marriage problem? What have I solved? And the marriage problem is divorce. And I teach couples how to create lifelong marriages. And what I do, how I'm able to do that, what's new is I actually address marriages mentally. I'm the first to do that. One of the biggest comments that I get from couples that I work with, one of the biggest realizations is when they realize I'm not actually giving behavioral advice, because that's what you get in marriage guidance today from the professionals. You get behavioral advice. And what I do that's unique is I address marriages mentally. In fact, a lot of these concepts that you learn when you understand my message are mental concepts, and where you might have thought of them yourself, you've not really heard about them or read about them in anything out in the public domain when it comes to marriage guidance. So what do I mean when I say I've solved the marriage problem? So what is the solution? In fact, one of the things that an engineer is trained to do, actually, let me go through my background first. Let me give you my background so you know where I'm coming from. I'm not a psychologist, and that turns out to be important. I actually have an engineering degree, an MBA, and I was actually the first semiconductor analyst on Wall Street to focus on the communications market. And the other part of my story is when I was 12 years old, I told my mom I wanted to be a Catholic priest, and then I discovered girls. So that career path kind of got derailed, but turns out that my engineering background, my Wall Street background, along with this mission I had as a child of wanting to be a priest, have all come together in solving the marriage problem. At the height of the market in 2000, the motivation for me doing this was I met a girl, fell in love with this girl. I'd actually known her for about 8 years, but she always had a boyfriend and I always had a girlfriend. But we got together when neither of us were dating, and we, as most people do when they fall in love, we got together very quickly, fell in love. We're going to spend the rest of our lives together. And then we started fighting. But more importantly, when we went to the therapist and the therapist wasn't helping, the pain of realizing when I realized the therapist wasn't going to really solve our problems led to me taking on in this mission of solving the marriage problem. It was the pain of that relationship not working out. And any of you that's ever gone through something that's serious, that's significant, know what I'm talking about. Very painful. And really my only outlet, the only thing I felt I could do was to write a book. So about 20 years ago, I spent about 2 years researching and writing this book. That is the foundation for what I do. I've been working on this for a long time. Actually published the book 14 years ago. And then now I'm working with couples to help teach them how to create lifelong marriages. So when I say I've solved the marriage problem, what I mean is the solution is equality. Again, one of the things that an engineer is trained to do is they're trained to look at what has changed to cause a problem. And before the 60s, our divorce rate was single digits. And the foundation of the marriage at that time was the man was in charge. It says so in the Bible. One of the first things you read in the Bible is the wife will obey her husband. It's called patriarchy. The Catholic Church promoted that. It was the foundation. What that meant is that the man was not only in charge, but the man also was responsible for the logical side of the relationship. He made the decisions logically, and he was also responsible for the finances because women couldn't work. And so obviously what has changed in the 60s was the education and employment of women. For the first time in the history of human civilization, women are now educated and employed. And so they question this subordinate role. And we just haven't yet figured out how this new structure of marriage where nobody's in charge, where it's based on equality, is to be structured. And that's in essence what I teach people. I teach people how to create a marriage, how to create a relationship where nobody's in charge, where both have to come to terms and agree on any of the conflicts within a marriage. It's the bottom line, the cause of the problems. So, and what I mean by equality is both the man and the woman have an equal say. They both have their own set of skills, just like if you and I were business partners. And so let me ask you this question. When I say the word equality, what one word comes to mind to you when I say the word equality? What comes to mind to you? What do you think about when I say the term equality? And what's interesting when I ask that question is I generally get responses like respect or equal say or fairness or really good comments. But my response after that is, what one word would you use to describe equality if you were actually enslaved? If you were a human slave, like back before the Civil War, you were in bondage and somebody owned you. You were actually somebody's slave. What would you use then to describe the word equality? And that's when the light bulb comes on, because the response when people think about that, the response is freedom. And at the end of the day, that is what you get when you create a marriage based on equality, is both the man and the woman are free to develop their own individuality. We're also in this whole another conversation about the age of individuality. We're going from a group mentality to an individual mentality. That's another psychological development that I discuss. I won't elaborate on that here. But when you understand the notion of mental development, equality means freedom. And that is what we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out how to create marriages where both the man and the woman are equally free to develop to become who they're supposed to be. And so the other aspect of solving the marriage problem, here's one of my comments that I use to summarize what I'm talking about. And one of the points of this comment is it's really simple. But the reality is that successful relationships are successful because couples get along. Unsuccessful relationships are unsuccessful because couples don't get along. It turns out it's that simple. That is the difference between success and failure, whether or not you get along with your partner. And so it's conflict resolution. That's in essence what I spend most of my message is the concept of conflict resolution, to really break down and make people consciously aware of how to address conflict. So what I want to do to begin is I want to discuss what I consider one of the most important concepts for couples to understand in order to create this marriage based on equality. In fact, I host a 2-month weekly workshop. In fact, you'll have an opportunity if you want to continue with me to join me in this workshop that I host for people that really want to get into details. And when you're done with that workshop, you will understand completely the road to success, how you create a marriage that will be successful for life. But I had a couple I was working with last week, and I asked them, in fact, at the beginning of every week of my 2-month weekly workshop, I asked the same question. What is the most important thing that I'm teaching you? And the husband, when I asked this question, started laughing. I was like, what was so funny? He said, I just asked my wife a couple hours ago, what was the answer to that question? And so here's one of the most important things I teach. Okay. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when most people see that phrase or read that phrase, what do they focus on? The pursuit of happiness part. What I do, though, is I break down the first 2 words in that saying, life and liberty. Life is a moral concept taught to us by the church. All life is precious. Believe it or not, that's not always been the case. Before Christianity and then equality, that was not the case. But the church teaches us morality. And in relationships, what that means is empathy. or understanding your partner's feelings. Liberty is a political concept. Again, it's taught to us in this democracy concept of equality. And in relationships, successful relationships, what equality means is respect or understanding your partner's thoughts. In fact, one of the most profound lessons I've ever had in my life, I don't know if you've ever read To Kill a Mockingbird, but there's one line in that book that changed my life. And in fact, every time you see a description of To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie from the 50s, it's always the same scene. It's Gregory Peck sitting on a park bench next to a boy. He looks at the boy and he goes, "If you want to understand a man, you have to walk in his shoes." And to me, that was very profound. I took that concept to heart and I actually live that every day. I'm always thinking about the other person's perspective. That is one of the most important things for a successful relationship, is when you are able to understand your partner's perspective and your partner is able to understand your perspective, it makes solving conflicts that much easier. And let me give you the biggest example that I use to demonstrate this point. Okay, so do you get mad at slow drivers? That's a problem that I've had for a long time. Well, I've actually solved that problem. I had an epiphany. One day I was driving behind a slow driver and I had this epiphany when I realized that that other driver was driving someplace too. When I was able to look at the other driver from their perspective, it opened up my eyes to understanding the problem that I was facing and how to solve that problem. Once I looked at it from the other driver's perspective, my anxiety behind slow drivers basically was eliminated. But the point is think about that from the perspective of the relationship. If you're able to understand your partner's perspective, think about how much easier it is to solve problems. Because the other part of conflict resolution, the problem is most of us know who've been in difficult relationships understand is it's control. This is the issue. This is what we're trying to figure out, where nobody's in charge. But relationships, not all of them, but most of them that are unsuccessful because of control. So again, conflict resolution. If we're able to solve conflicts, then we're able to solve the marriage problem. And so what I do then, after I teach couples to understand things from their partner's perspective, then I get into the real breakdown of conflict resolution. In fact, this is when I really get into the psychology stuff. Again, my 2-month weekly workshop, I'll go into a lot deeper details. This is, again, when you get your head around this in the workshop, you really walk out of that workshop with a firm understanding, a firm foundation on making sure that you and your spouse are going to approach conflict successfully. I make couples consciously aware of how to approach conflict. So I spend a lot of time discussing conflict resolutions and conflicts. And so what I do to begin with is I discuss the 2 different types of conflict. The first is disagreements. Okay, when you and I disagree on something. In fact, it's really interesting because that's the way, if you and I were business partners, think about how we would approach a conflict. I am the accountant and you want to buy a $5,000 computer. So obviously now we have a conflict. We can't afford it. So the point is that using that example, it really brings clarity to how you solve a problem with disagreements. I would understand your perspective, why you want to buy that kind of computer, and you would understand the financial challenges we're having. We would understand each other's perspective, and we would come together and we would find a solution that we both understood and we both agreed to. And so both of us appreciate and are, in essence, happy with the solution that we figure out. So that is in fact, the thing about disagreements are logical, disagreements are problem solving, and disagreements are forward looking. That's the dynamics on how people handle disagreements. But the issue here, just as an opposite of you and I being business partners, we were romantic partners, then we'd have an emotional component that's much more significant than our business partnership. And obviously that's what describes couples, relationships. They're so much more emotional than business partnerships. So that's when you get the other approach to conflicts, and that's arguments. And this is when you really get clarity, when you understand how to address arguments and why arguments exist and what to do about them. It really gives you a firm understanding on really the significant problem when it comes to the difference between success and failure in relationships. Because the reality is arguments are control mechanisms. That's why people argue. One or both are trying to control the outcome of a conflict. And so what I do, this is the real breakthrough, in fact, when I realized the significance, what I'm about to explain to you, I realized I really open up the relationship to the dynamics even beyond the actual relationship, which are important to understand. And arguments really clarify that. And what I do is, I call it the hierarchy of the argument. I break arguments down into their component parts. Okay, turns out there's a process that we go through in life that leads to us becoming angry and argumentative. It begins with an insecurity, which is defined as fear and anxiety. Your parents got divorced, for example. Okay, think about that. If your parents got divorced, one thing that might happen is you bring that fear into your marriage. So you create, when something like that happens to you, and the younger you are, the more significant the lesson is, particularly when it's a negative lesson, the more it's misunderstood when you become an adult. So your parents are your first big influences. In fact, I'll elaborate on that in a second, and the significance of your relationship with your parents. But your parents, in this example, they get divorced, and now you're afraid of divorcing your own marriage. That's what leads to the next step in the mental process, and that's becoming judgmental. It turns out, and this is one of many firsts that you will hear with me that I've discovered that no one else has discovered before, but it turns out that our mental problems are nothing more than prejudices. This is one of the things that I've discovered that's new, is that the mental problems that we have as a society today is based on a preconceived opinion, which creates a fear, which is emotionally based from something that's happened to us in our past. And that fear is then what leads to becoming judgmental, which then leads to anger. So it's that mental process. And what I'm doing in this discussion is I'm connecting the dots. This is the bottom line with this conversation between fear and anger. People don't get angry just because. When people get angry, they get angry because of some underlying fear that's motivating their anger. So let's discuss an example. Say you come home late from work and your partner gets mad at you. Okay, now the caveat here is that you weren't out drinking with your friends. You weren't out doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. You literally did get that phone call at 5 in the afternoon. It took an hour. You didn't think about calling your spouse on the way home, and you get home and your spouse is mad at you. Think about the dynamics that would take place in that example. It's fight or flight. This is the instinct that we have when we're confronted with conflict that is emotional. It's fight or flight. We're either going to respond quite often in kind. They get angry at us, we're going to get angry back. Or the flee, which is a big thing that eventually happens in unsuccessful relationships, is the other. We'll just ignore it. We'll just flee from the conflict and not deal with it. Okay? But here's what's so interesting when you think about this dialogue. What you realize, this is the real eye-opener, what you realize is it has nothing to do with you coming home late from work. You realize that there's a fear underlying that the anger, it's self-esteem issues, it's abandonment issues. Again, maybe mom and dad got divorced when you were a child. It's these fears that's motivating the anger for you coming home late to work. It was a question that took me years to figure out. If you're not really doing something wrong, coming home late from work, it's not really right or wrong. It's somebody thinks it's a problem. How do you deal with that? And when I had the epiphany on solving this problem, it was really an eye-opener because of its simplicity as well. Just like the difference between success and failure is getting along or not getting along. Because what I realized, that's when I connected the dots between fear and anger. So here's a big thing that I teach couples when I work with them on handling an emotional conflict. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically neutralizing the fight or flight syndrome. This is where you have to create a judgment-free zone in your marriage. This is ultimately what you're getting to in a successful marriage, where people are able to bring up things about themselves. Because again, the issue here is not you coming home late from work. So what you do when you get home late from work and your partner gets mad at you, if you're able to neutralize the fight or flight syndrome and turn the conversation back on your partner. This is why you have to have an open conscience, a clear conscience, and not be doing something that you can't bring up because you're embarrassed to bring that up. You literally were late from work because of this 5 p.m. phone call. You're able to turn the conversation back onto the real root of the issue, and that's the fear underlying the anger. What happened in your spouse's background that has led to them being fearful of you coming home late from work? What does it mean in some insecurity that was created in their background? And let me give you the point about it. This is really, it turns out to be the biggest psychological concept that I teach. Okay? The only reason why I can comfortably and confidently tell anybody that I have solved the marriage problem is because I forgave my parents when I was 25 years old. It turns out the biggest factor in a marriage is the relationship with the parents, because that's when you first learn about love. And when I forgave my parents, is I in essence eliminated the anxieties that was created from my childhood, and it allowed me to look objectively onto my own relationship as opposed to subjectively through the eyes of my childhood. And that is when that now introduces a psychological component to the conversation of marriage. And believe it or not, it's quite honestly fascinating to me that there's no relationship books that I've actually discovered. And I read 24 relationship books. There's no relationship books where the author, who's a professional psychologist, has actually addressed marriage psychologically. It's not been done before. And what I'm doing with this hierarchy of the argument is I'm introducing a psychological component to marriage, which is also a first, and a very significant first. Because if you're not addressing marriages, not only mentally, but psychologically as well, you'll never solve the marriage problem. And so that is when we get into details. In fact, just as a point, and I don't want to get into detail on who Carl Jung is, but one of my ultimate objectives, Carl Jung was a student of Freud, and they had their famous breakup in 1912. Jung actually went much further than Freud did in discovering how the mind works. So one of my ultimate objectives is to ultimately replace Freud with Jung, and in a lot more detail than that. But this is just a taste. What I just did is I summarized for you basically a 2-hour conversation down into the time that we went through in this conversation. But this is the introduction to my message. And now I do want to talk to you about my 2-month weekly workshop. In fact, what you want to do is you want to text marriage to 26786, and you'll get some information about me and my background. You also want to email me at my email address, which is timkellis@happyrelationships.com. Again, timkellis@happyrelationships.com. And we can continue a dialogue on this 2-month weekly workshop. And the point about this, I've done the research. My message is much further than anything you're gonna find. This is much further than the 5 love languages or men and women being from different planets. And you can go do the research yourself and figure all this out. It's gonna be a very time consuming, very expensive. It's obviously that versus the cost of divorce, all the expenses that go into that. You have to look at this as an investment in your marriage. That's what you really want to think about when it comes to working with me. And again, married, in a relationship, single, what I'm doing is I am lowering the anxieties behind marriages in general. A lot of people that aren't married because there's such a fear in our society today. Now, a general fear of marriage is because of our culture of divorce, which is 60 years old. So what I'm doing is I'm lowering the anxiety. So at any point where you're single all the way to married, you can benefit from this. Obviously, it's more valuable and more pertinent to somebody who's married now, but this is your opportunity to discover the keys to a successful marriage. So please reach out to me. Love to discuss with you the details. This is an opportunity for you to invest just like you invest in any other aspect of your life. Think about that as well. You know, how much other areas and aspects of your life do you spend time on, focus on, energy, money, investments, that kind of stuff. But what time and expense do you spend on learning how to create a successful marriage? And quite honestly, the reason for that is until this message, there's not been a place where you could turn to actually find a platform that you and your spouse can understand that would lead to a lifelong marriage. And that's why this whole thing it's new for everybody. So you have an opportunity here, and just so you know, it's going to become a lot more expensive because I realize my mission is to lower the divorce rate. So I'm going to start working with groups of people. You want to get access to this as soon as you can. So you really want to get started on this, today. I would highly recommend you doing this today. I realize that I've got the message that could solve your marriage problems. And I also realize, most importantly, that there's really no place else that you could turn to. So let me just end it with that. Again, I love this. I'm extremely passionate about this. When I say I'm going to lower the divorce rate, I'm serious about this. Once I get my message out, this message is going to have a profound impact on our culture of marriage today. It's about time somebody has put their foot down on this culture of divorce and put a body of knowledge together that can educate and teach couples how to understand the path to success. And that's in essence what I do. So I appreciate the time that you've given me. Look forward to following up with you. One more thing in closing here. I also have on Facebook, it's called The Marriage Support Group, approaching 10,000 members. It's really been exploding. That's a community that I've created, not only me, but other marriage experts who have their messages as well. So there's an outlet that people looking for help can turn to in order to get a better understanding of what the keys to success are. So there's all kinds of different messages. You'll find mine is most composite, complete or whatever, but there's still a lot of people that are offering valuable insight on a successful marriage. So feel free to join me on my marriage support group as well. I do look forward to following up with you. And again, thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Tim Kellis, and I look forward to following up with you. Thank you very much. Bye.